Good day. It's time again to talk about cheapies that shred, cheap heats. This is records that are inexpensive but great. And if you're feeling bad about your collection or had a bad day or something like that and you need a pick-me-up, you might find one of these records in your local record store. And take it from me, if you find one of these, it's probably not going to cost more than $10, and it's going to be great. You're going to dig it, I hope, if your tastes are anything like mine. This segment, I'm going to discuss more straight ahead modal acoustic jazz, although there are a few fusion-y bits thrown in. I can't help myself. That's my favorite kind of music, is jazz rock, aggressive jazz rock fusion. That's what I like. But anyway, I'm going to talk about some other stuff as well, and most of this will be in the acoustic sort of jazz realm. And a lot of these records, like I said, you can find them single-digit money, $10 or less. Might cost you a little bit more. Might be worth picking up if they cost you a little bit more and they're in nice shape. But don't pay a lot of money for these things. All of these are hard filed. All these come from my collection. And here goes. Number one at the top of the list is an oldie. It's from the 50s. Alabama Concerto by John Benson Brooks, featuring Cannonball Adderley and Art Farmer. Also Barry Galbraith on guitar and Milt Hinton on bass. It's a really interesting record, and Benson Brooks was a really interesting character. He rose to prominence in the swing era as a songwriter and arranger for Tommy Dorsey and Les Brown. Later on, he became fascinated with field recordings, the occult. He studied with John Cage. He studied with Joseph Schillinger. I mean, this guy was a pretty advanced musical mind, and winds up being grouped with sort of the third stream musicians, the people who are trying to blend classical and jazz. And eventually he became the protege, or a pal anyway, of Gil Evans. And Gil Evans recorded several of his compositions early in his career, and actually continued to perform one of them, Where Flamingos Fly, right up to the very end of his career. So Benson Brooks is a really interesting character. Only recorded a few records. This is his second one, I think. And it's a really interesting acoustic jazz thing. No drums, which is unusual for me. I got it as sort of a throw-in. A friend of mine who runs record store and collects tons of records. He has every year he has a big chud sale just to get rid of all the stuff that he can't move, and sells a bunch of stuff for like $1. And so I got this for, I think, $1 or $2. I think $2. And it's an original pressing. I don't think it was reissued. I don't know if there's a CD, but it's not a tremendously sought after record. But I'll tell you what, Cannonball Adderley just is next level on this. Art Farmer plays beautifully. Barry Galbraith, a really neglected figure in jazz, is also wonderful on this. And of course, Milt Hinton, you don't really need a drummer with Milt Hinton playing. The compositions are really interesting. They reflect a journey that Benson Brooks took to rural Alabama to record folk music with a friend of his. Not Alan Lomax, but somebody like that. And he wound up writing a bunch of music based on what he heard and what he helped record. And the compositions are really inventive. The playing is beautiful, and it's just quite a bargain all the way around, even if you pay more than $10 for it. I think you'll find it really interesting. It's not dated at all. Now, it's funny that he, later on in the late 60s, early 70s, recorded an album called Avant Slant, or Avant Slant, however you want to pronounce it, which is a bizarre sort of sound collage of avant-garde jazz and poetry, spoken word, and it's almost like a Lord Buckley or Ken Nordine kind of a thing. That record goes for a little bit more money, although I have seen it in thrift stores. That one's pretty wild. If you see that, you might want to check that out if you like 60s beatnik sort of novelty lore. But this is the one to get for pure musical value. Next up is a musician that really prolific, and I think that's why a lot of his records don't go for much money. Paul Horn is a flute player, saxophone player originally, but later on concentrated on the flute. Like his contemporary Herbie Mann, he was very prolific. Overall, I think their body of work is really kind of similar, although Horn might have been a little bit less compromising in terms of, going for the popularity, and big sales. I think Mann had it over Paul Horn. But Paul Horn did a lot of really interesting records. Wound up doing a lot of kind of smooth jazz, new age kinds of things later on in his career. But early on, he did a lot of risky, daring sort of music that stands up even today. And all of them can be had for less than $10. Easy, no problem. They'll pop up. This is one that Christopher Cole told me about or posted about on Facebook. And it just literally popped up like 2 days later in a bin that I was looking through. These things happen. This is Impressions of Cleopatra, and they're obviously trying to capitalize on the success of the movie, whatever it was called, Cleopatra, I don't know, with Richard Burton and Liz Taylor, who's pictured on the front, looking pretty awesome as usual. Timing strip here is a promo. This did not cost much at all, and it's an incredibly good record. Surprisingly good for the sort of exploito nature of it. Really interesting sidelight. Horn is uncredited on this instrument, but he plays a solo on the Khene, Khene, which is like an ancient multiple reed instrument. It has almost a sort of harmonica sound to it. It's a really an interesting sound. I think Stefan Mikas plays one on a lot of his records. It's a really interesting sound, and it's not credited on here, but it's Paul Horn tooting away on this thing, and it is wild sounding. He's backed up by a great bunch of LA session types, and it's not glossy or sold out at all. It is pretty hardcore stuff, and can be had for next to nothing. Another Paul Horn record that you should look out for is this one, Nexus. This is from the 70s, late 70s, I believe. And Nexus was a Canadian percussion ensemble, and Paul Horn plays flute to their compositions. And this is almost kind of Zappa-esque sounding. Lots of percolating percussion and crazy unison lines, and it's just an interesting, bizarre record. He must have been granted quite a bit of freedom by CBS to make this record, and then they put it out. I don't know how it did sales-wise, but it sure is an interesting record, and it can be had for next to nothing. Excuse me. Finally, in the triumvirate of Paul Horn selections I'll be discussing, I couldn't not include this. Any discussion of Paul Horn and his music has to include Tirados Soul. This is essentially an Egberto Gismonti record in disguise. Paul Horn's name's on it. He plays flute on it, solos a lot. All the compositions are Egberto Gismonti. Gismonti plays keyboards and guitar on this. The backing musicians are the Brazilian all-stars, Airto and Robertino Silva. All those guys are all over this thing. Tremendous record. Brazilian fire from beginning to end. If you like, and this again is a little bit more on the fusion tip, because lots of Fender Rhodes, lots of synthesizers, lots of phase shifted, ring modulated sounds. If you like that kind of thing, that kind of 70s thing, you can't miss this. And it's all like really up-tempo, really crazy up-tempo. I love this record. Can't say enough good things about it, and nobody talks about it, and it's never been expensive. So get it. That's enough of that. What we're listening to now is also got Paul Horn involvement. It's David Friesen's Amber Skies. And it's just simply a wonderful acoustic jazz record, kind of modal, modern jazz. Great personnel. Joe Henderson, as you can read, Joe Henderson's on it. Paul Motion, Airto, and Chick Corea. Friesen is a bassist, really well known in the Pacific Northwest, played with a lot of different people. He actually had a long-standing musical partnership with Paul Horn, played with him on a lot of his records right towards the end of his career. Friesen also recorded for the Inner City label, which, as you might remember, is one of my favorite labels for cheap goodness, or good cheapness, whatever you want to call it. His two records that I have on that label, Stardance and Waterfall Rainbow, are both excellent, and you should own them both. This one is exceptionally good. It's on the Pacific Arts label, which there's another really great, inexpensive jazz record on the same label, New Moon in Zitron, which I forgot to pull out, but maybe we'll talk about later. Anyway, this is as good as that, I think. This is just beautiful, radiant, modern jazz, and nobody knows about it, and it won't cost you more than $10, I swear. Amber Skies by David Friesen. Some of these inexpensive jazz records have like guest shots by famous people, but the group itself never really did much. So this is a prime example of that. The Jazz Corps. This is their only record that I know of, featuring Tommy Peltier on cornet. Roland Kirk is on here. And Roland Kirk, Rahsaan, must have been feeling really, really, really good the day he recorded this, because he is absolutely unstoppable. There's a CD version of this out, and if you ever see that, that's what you should get. It might actually cost more than the LP, because there's extra tracks, and then there's a couple of fade-outs here that you hear in their entirety on the CD. And let me tell you, Rahsaan is en fuego throughout. Is one of the great, to me, one of the great jazz performances by anyone ever. You know, the whole record is just jaw-droppingly fantastic. I've owned several copies of this record. I have the CD. That's never going to leave my clutches. That's white knuckle. Hang on to that one. This I've had a couple of copies of because I just like the record, but invariably somebody expresses interest or is curious, and I'm like, oh, here. So this is a fantastic record, but get the CD if you see it. Interesting personnel on here. Bill Plummer on bass. As you know, he was associated with Emil Richards, made those crazy raga, jazz, and weird time signature records for Impulse. Also, Lynn Blessing on vibes later on turned up in Tim Weisberg's band. Also recorded his own record, I think Sunset Painter, Rainbow Painter, something like that. Anyway, this is excellent. This is excellent. It won't set you back much at all. I've never paid more than $10 for any of the copies of that record that I've run across. Here's a record by someone who's really obscure, that I don't know what happened to him, but the personnel on here is unreal. Stafford James on bass, Carlos Garnett on tenor, Bob Berg on tenor in his first recorded appearance ever, and Norman Connors on drums. Kenny Gill is a piano player. This came out on Joe Bauer's label. Joe Bauer, as you might recall, was a member of the Youngbloods. Remember them? Joe Bauer had his own record label called Raccoon Records. And I think he went by a different name in the Youngbloods, like a one-word name. I don't know what, though. But this is a really outstanding record. It's all acoustic. If it had come out on Strata East or something like that, it would go for megabucks. But it came out on the Raccoon subsidiary of Warner Brothers in 1970, and it just doesn't go for much money at all. I see this all the time for less than $10. And you could really fool a lot of people with this record. You could really fool a lot of people with this record. It's like a Strata East thing. You could call it spiritual jazz if you wanted to. I don't like using that term, but you youngsters do. So check this record out sometime if you ever see it. It shouldn't cost more than $10. Kenny Gill with Carlos Garnett and Bob Berg, Stafford James, and Norman Connors. Love it. And the title, What Was, What Is, and What Will Always Be. Ooh. Here's another artist who has done a lot of really good records, none of which sell for a lot of money in the used LP market. As you can see, I got this one for, I don't think I paid $3 for this. Anyway, this is Ernie Lawrence. He was more important, I guess, as a mentor to younger musicians. There's a number of musicians whom he taught and worked with and helped out with their careers. He was very well connected back in the day. This is from 1983. He was still kicking ass in 1983. This is a great record despite the sort of cheesy cover, and it's on the Dr. Jazz label. That's Bob Thiele's label after Flying Dutchman kind of met its demise. But this has great personnel on it. Basically, it's Lookout Farm, those guys, backing Ernie Lawrence. So it's got Tom Harrell, Mike Richmond, Jeff Williams, Bottle Roy, the tabla player, a bunch of percussionists, a harp player. This is a really cool kind of acoustic fusion record almost. Another one recommended to me by Christopher Cole. I was already aware of Lawrence's work with his earlier groups. He has a great record out on the Project 3 label with Larry Coryell, Carlene Ray, and Roy Haynes. It's fantastic. But I did not realize that this one was so good. It's really strong. For being from the 80s and having cheesy cover like this, it's mind-bendingly good, and it's cheap. Another artist that's kind of passed over and overlooked unfairly, I think, is this blind saxophone player from Pittsburgh named Eric Kloss. These are the 2 records I have left by him. I've had like 6 or 7 at various times in my collection. These 2 are the more fusion-oriented ones, Body's Warmth and Celebration. Body's Warmth is killer, just a killer fusion record. But more jazz fusion, you know what I'm saying? Kloss is an alto saxophone player. If he had played things a little bit differently, he would have been a lot like Richie Cole. But I think Kloss really had his own vision of what he wanted to do in music, and it didn't have anything to do with playing bebop louder and faster and louder and faster and louder and faster. He really is a creative musician in every sense of the word. So he chased the fusion thing for a while. It was associated with Pat Martino, recorded a lot of records for Muse and Cobblestone. I don't know what he's doing now. He's not that old, so he might still be around. But both of these records come highly recommended. Kind of under the radar, excellent fusion with strong jazz roots. And of course, they've got these great players on them. Terry Silverlight on drums, and Barry Miles, who is worth a whole episode of Cheap Heat by himself. He's done so many great records in the fusion realm that are inexpensive. Another guy that's chronically inexpensive, never see his records go for more than a couple of bucks, is tenor saxophonist Bennie Wallace. And he's from Texas. He epitomizes a whole tough Texas tenor approach. This is just one of the records I have by him. I've got a good half dozen of his records, and he's recorded all kinds of stuff with all kinds of people. This is actually kind of a funky R&B sax record with Dr. John and John Scofield and Stevie Ray Vaughan on it. You'll find this for a couple of bucks. It came out in the 80s. It's actually quite good. It's really good. A lot of his other records are more straight-ahead jazz, post-Coltrane, sort of big bellowing tenor dates. There's a record he did called Big Jim's Tango with Elvin Jones. It's outstanding. Should be in every collection. There's a bunch of records he did with Chick Corea. He did a Monk tribute, which is everybody's got to do a Monk tribute, right? All of them are really good. He played a lot with Danny Richmond. Eddie Gomez is on a lot of his records. So Bennie Wallace, if you see one, they're usually on Enja, and you should just get it. You should just get them. They're just good. They're just solid listens all the way through. Another neglected artist that I never understood why she didn't get more publicity is JoAnne Brackeen. And she recorded a triumvirate of amazing records for 2 different labels, Tappan Zee, which was Bob James's Vanity subsidiary of Columbia in the late 70s, and then this Special Identity for Antilles in the early 80s. They all have the same personnel, Jack DeJohnette and Eddie Gomez, backing her up. And on this record in particular, she almost gets to like a Cecil Taylor level of intensity. I mean, what a talent. Amazing playing. Pushes Jack DeJohnette to some of his highest heights. I mean, I don't know why people weren't raving about her records. I love them. They're fantastic. Those 3 records, one's called Keyed In, and another one's called Ancient Dynasty, and then there's this, Special Identity. All not going to set you back much money, and all tremendous, adventurous, edging into freedom sort of jazz, but always with really strong melodies and just totally over the top, amazing playing. This record's appeared in some threads on Facebook recently, and I couldn't help but include it. It's something that Christopher Cole and I have discussed repeatedly. Jill McManus, Symbols of Hopi. Evidently, she took some inspiration from the Hopi Indians in the Desert Southwest, which is where I'm from, and or where I'm living anyway. And with great backing personnel: Billy Hart, Mark Johnson, Tom Harrell again, Dave Liebman. If you see Dave Liebman, Tom Harrell, and Billy Hart, Mike Richmond, Mark Johnson, on a record, you should just buy it. Just buy it. Actually, Liebman's group Quest could easily have been included in this string of records. It's a wonderful acoustic jazz record, very inventive. I don't know if McManus ever did anything before or after, but this is a really nice record. Very rarely see it for more than $5. Easy pickup. It's on Concord Jazz, a label that's kind of like Pablo. It doesn't really get A lot of props from the record collecting community, but it's actually a fantastic record, and you should check it out. Finally, 2 guitar jazz records by the same guy. Nobody seems to know or care about Van Manakas except me. Here's one record, Love Songs. That's going to put you off right there. If you're looking for some hardcore jazz, you think, right, I'm going to buy a record called Love Songs. And this one with the Greek letter on the cover. If you missed out on these records, they're both. This one is a private issue, not a private issue, but it's on his own label. It's got Bob Moses and Harvey Swartz on it, so again, you know it's good. This one's on Rounder, which again is almost a curse of death for a jazz musician. This has a piano player that I've never heard of before, since Mario Parent, Mike Richmond, and Bob Moses on it. Both of these records are fantastic. Really excellent, high energy guitar jazz. If you like John Abercrombie, people like that, you're really going to get into this. Not a lot of effects, pretty pristine guitar sound, but definitely getting out there, like Abercrombie. But he kind of has his own sound. Van Manakas, highly recommended. You'll see those everywhere. I got this one for, neither of these cost me more than a couple of bucks, and I see them around quite a bit. And you should too. Anyway, hopefully you got something out of that, and I'll stop talking now. Leave comments in the thread below, and who knows, I'll come back with more in a little bit.